Hello everyone, my name is Bailey Conrad, and today I will present my paper titled The Resilience of Shel Silverstein's Children's Poetry Through the Ages. Have you ever wondered what makes children's literature stick in our minds? Is it its simple but repetitive nature? Is it the themes of the story, perhaps the morals that the story presents? Well, I wonder the same thing. Specifically, I wondered that about Shel Silverstein. What made his poetry last nearly 2 decades after his passing? That brings me to my research question. What stylistic and thematic elements contribute to the age-long durability of children's literature? To examine this question, I will bring you through my roadmap. I'll give you a little bit of background about Silverstein's career as an artist, from cartoonist to a children's poet. I will examine how minimalism functions in poetry. I will then examine how dark realism functions in children's literature, how whimsy functions in children's literature, and then I will talk to you about my conclusions. Silverstein, cartoonist to children's poet. Silverstein grew up in Chicago, Illinois. He went to Roosevelt High School and then attended the University of Illinois. Then he was drafted into the Army in 1953, where he became the editor of the Pacific Stars and Stripes. He drew cartoons, he wrote articles, he even edited. And he created many political cartoons. Here I have one called, "To be perfectly frank, sir, I don't have any room for an M1." After he finished his tour in 1955, Silverstein returned to the United States and was drafted by Hugh Hefner to write and draw for Playboy magazine. He wrote an article, a regular article called Around the World with Silverstein. He traveled all over the world and documented his travels in the form of articles, cartoons, and even photographs. Here I present to you one that says, "You see, my dear, if any other cartoonist tried to draw a man and woman completely nude like this, front view, no magazine would print it, but I draw it, and they print it." Finally, in 1963, Shel Silverstein's editor convinced him to become a children's poet. She felt that he had the humor and the artistic capabilities, and he was quoted to have been taken kicking and screaming all the way to the printing room. Here is a picture from his first children's book titled Lafcadio, the Lion Who Shot Back. As you can see, all of these images are simple black and white sketches, which was Silverstein's calling card. He was well known for simple black and white images, which presents me to my first theme, minimalism in poetry. Shel Silverstein's use of minimalism in his children's poems helps him to retain his audience's attention so as to keep them engaged and interested in his art. His peers agree that even though Shel Silverstein left his mark on American children's poetry, his form and style left much to be desired. But maybe his simplistic and basic style lent to his everlasting imprint on children's minds. Eric Smeagol and Daniel MacDonald state that systematic repetition is one of the basic principles of minimalism, and they applied this to an experiment on elementary children that showed students better retained information because of the extreme brevity or directness of expression. Shel Silverstein uses minimalism and brevity and directness in most of his poetry, which allows his targeted audience a better chance to absorb his art. Short, quick, and direct poems also allow him to direct his audience attention, as minimalist poetry often resists dramatic interpretation and invites the audience to focus instead on an optical or literary phenomenon. Shel Silverstein usually pairs a quick sketch with his poems, a sketch that depicts a part of the poem, but whose relevance may not become apparent until the end of the poem. Using minimalism in his poetry keeps the focus on the art and ensures the audience can make it through to the end of the poem and understand the relevance of the art without getting bored, distracted, or uninterested. As stated by Jan Baitens, minimalist poetry constitutes the pinnacle of an evolution toward ever greater purity and essence. Considering that he is creating art meant for the consumption of children, it would make sense that he would want his art to remain pure and that he would only want to include essential topics and lines in his work. By styling his art using minimalism principles, Shel Silverstein created durable art that remains relevant and entertaining years after his passing. The second poem in his book, entitled Where the Sidewalk Ends, Magic, is only 8 lines long, each with less than 8 words. But it manages to reach the hearts of his young audience by appealing to their imaginations. Minimalism in poetry allows the poet to focus the poem to portray their message as succinctly as possible. Minimalism rarely allows for interpretation, and this poem seems no different. The title of the poem also leaves little room for interpretation. Clearly, this poem is about magic, as it references various magical beings. The last 2 lines state, "But all the magic I've known, I've had to make myself." The minimalist style of these last 2 lines leads to little interpretation. Clearly, all the magic is inside of you. The function of dark realism. Silverstein captures his audience's attention through the use of dark realism in his children's poetry. In The Little Blue Engine from his novel Where the Sidewalk Ends, Silverstein puts his own spin on the classic tale of the little engine that could. The original story tells of a small but determined engine that sees a dauntingly high hill ahead that she may or may not be able to get over, but she believes in herself and attempts to climb the hill anyway. Silverstein's darker, more realistic spin characterizes the engine as weak and tired, details not mentioned in the original tale. These details immediately establish the engine as the underdog of the story, encouraging the reader to cheer for the Little Blue Engine and capturing their attention, hoping the engine will successfully climb the hill. Silverstein describes the engine as having a face blush red, and with this characterization, the audience becomes further involved in the engine's success because though Silverstein talks of an animated train engine, most people can relate to the universal strain of attempting to accomplish a difficult feat. To further promote this narrative, Silverstein continues to describe the actions of the engine as he chugs and strains up the hill by repeating and rewording the struggle of the engine in different ways, and in different stanzas, Silverstein creates a realistic and relatable struggle for the audience. As the poem wears on, Silverstein notes that the little engine slowly climbed a foot at a time, which seems much more realistic than the original's depiction of the engine racing up the hill as fast as possible. By making the engine's actions seem more realistic, the audience becomes more invested in the success of the Little Blue Engine, capturing their attention and creating more suspense. The next stanza does not have any darkly realistic portrayals of the engine's journey up the high hill, but this absence of realism only serves to make the dark realism of the next stanza that much more jarring. The fourth and final stanza of the poem describes the engine's literal downfall. The Little Blue Engine slid down and mashed into engine hash. Throughout the poem, the language and realism serve to encourage the audience to cheer for the engine, as does his reference to a classic tale with an ending already familiar to the audience. However, in twisting this familiar tale into a much darker narrative, Silverstein leaves a lasting impact on his audience, as they must feel betrayed and traumatized by such a realistic ending to a story they invested themselves in. Another recurrent theme throughout Silverstein's poetry is whimsy and nonsensicality. Whimsy is something most of us are familiar with, as most children's tales are filled with nonsensical ideas such as unicorns, mermaids, leprechauns, and other various magical creatures. This theme is most prevalent in Silverstein's poem, The Unicorn. In this poem, Silverstein puts his own twist on a popular narrative, as he did with The Little Blue Engine. However, this time, he puts a twist on the tale of Noah's Ark. The tale talks of unicorns during the time before man, back whenever animals roamed the earth. Throughout this poem, Silverstein uses the classic tale of God telling Noah to build an ark to save all of his animals, to create a sense of wonder and awe. To most children, God seems like a fairy tale. The whimsy created throughout this poem, from the use of unicorns and cats and rats and elephants, helps children learn about a classic tale and makes it last in their brains longer, as the whimsy of the unicorn appeals to their younger, less developed mind. Which brings me to my conclusions. How did Silverstein's poetry last but 20 years after his death? Well, he used a simple but effective style. He used minimalist poetry that helped to focus his intended audience's attention, and it was effective. Dark but everlasting. The dark realism definitely left an imprint on the children's mind, as they will never get the scene of the little engine that could crashing down to the edge of the mountain out of their head. And it was fun, witty, and memorable. The tale of a unicorn and cats and rats and elephants definitely left an impression on my mind. And here's my works cited.